Well, hello, faithful politics watchers. If you're watching us and joining us on YouTube or listening, if you're joining us via the podcast on any of our various platforms that we post the podcast to, this is Josh Bertram. I'm your faithful host. And we have, as always, with us our ever faithful and political host, Will. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Thanks for asking.
Good, good. And today I'm really excited. We get to talk to a veteran author. Well, he's not a veteran like a United States veteran. I said that wrong, but Kyle Duncan is a 35-year publishing veteran. Hey, do they hand out medals for publishing veterans? Is that Pulitzer Prize?
No,
That must be Pulitzer Prize.
no. My dad served on a battleship during World War II, so he was the real veteran in the family.
Well, there you go, man. Well, hey,
Yeah,
you have veteran blood in
yeah,
you.
for
And
sure.
Kyle has been a New York Times bestselling writer and ghostwriter. He's worked with scores of bestselling authors, including John Wooden, Dr. Gary Chapman, Voice of the Martyrs, and Toby Mack. Duncan has a English literature degree from UCLA and writes full-time from his home in San Diego, California. And he and his wife, Suzanne, have three biological daughters and an adopted son, Corey Janya, who is from Mariupol, Ukraine. Did I say that right?
You did very good.
Mariupol. Well, Kyle,
Mariupol.
thanks
Yeah,
so much, Mariupol. Thanks so much for joining us today. And we're going to be talking about your book, Hope for Ukraine, that you've written and has come out this year from Baker Publishing. So, talk to me just a little bit. How did you get into writing about Ukraine, and how did this idea of writing a book about Ukraine surface and come before you?
sure. First of all, Josh and Will, I want to thank you very much for having me. We've tried to do this a couple times. I had a little bit of sickness. I had my COVID 2.0 a few weeks ago, and but it's really a pleasure to be with you guys. And I just want to say, give a plug to this podcast. I think it's wonderful, especially the coverage you've been doing lately with the Palestinian Israeli conflict, which obviously affects us all, whether we're believers or not. It's obviously a very intense international situation. Yeah, that's a great question. How did I end up writing a book about Ukraine? The easy answer is that the Holy Spirit opened a lot of doors for me, and
Nice.
they swung open, and I walked through them. But yeah, so that story, which is part of the book, I tell it in the book in a chapter called Zhenya, but really you have to go back all the way to '01. My wife and I at the time had two biological daughters, little ones. They're in their 20s now, but at that time they were little, and my wife Suzanne became pregnant with our third little boy that we named Joseph. But in the womb, we found out that he had very severe genetic defects and a condition called trisomy 13. And we were in Santa Barbara at Cottage Hospital, and the doctors were sympathetic, but they said, you just need to terminate the pregnancy because this kid isn't going to live outside the womb. And before I could open my big fat mouth and say something fairly snarky back, my wife said, is my life in danger carrying this child? And they said no. And she said, well, God gives life, God takes away, and we're going to see this pregnancy determination. They thought we were crazy, but our son miraculously actually was born and lived for 3 days, which defied
Wow.
all. He had all sorts of internal complications, and and then he died. We were supposed to have the service at about 10 a.m. on September 11th of 2001. And 2 days
Wow.
before, our doctor friend, we were going to do it in his backyard. He said, I got a surgery suddenly. Can we move the service to Thursday? So my son died on Labor Day. We were supposed to have the service on 9/11. It got moved to 9/13. So some of my relatives back east couldn't even make it because, of course, planes were grounded.
Mm.
It was quite a week. My best friend from high school died in Tower Two. So it was
Oh
intense,
my
as you guys can
gosh.
imagine. No one ever, the adage is you never want to, adults should never have to bury a child, a parent. And
Absolutely.
we got through that. Two of the NICU nurses came to Christ at the service at the memorial.
Wow.
So Joseph's legacy lives on, to this day. So anyway, a couple of years later, we had a third child, a girl named Zoe, which you guys have pastor background, know your Hebrew, which means spirit or life in Hebrew. And she was kind of our bonus baby. And I thought, I'm all done with it. I'm
Mm.
great. I'm a dad. I got 3 daughters. And then my wife, when Zoe was a little one, we were living in Minnesota at the time. I was working for a publishing house, Baker Publishing Group, by the way, the ones that ended up publishing my book. So there's a shout out to everybody at Baker. And at the time, I was VP publisher of nonfiction for one of their imprints called Bethany House. But anyway, we were in Minnesota. We had our 3 girls. Youngest is an infant, Zoe. And one night, my wife is just sitting there, and she's not the kind of person who would just walk in this room right now and say, "The Lord's telling me this, this, this." It does happen, and she does, hear from God. But it was that small, still voice saying, "I want you to adopt." And she was like, "Whoa, this is way out of left field." So the second night, we're back, doing the nightly routine, right? So it's the next night, same thing. She's like, "Well, Lord, I've been praying for unwanted children around the world, but are you sure this is what you want us to do?" And then the third night, God was very specific, and He said, "I want you to adopt, but not a baby, but a little boy, and I want you to adopt from Ukraine." It was that specific. And my wife, I'm more
Wow.
the geography nerd, and I go to TripAdvisor and do those geography quizzes to see if I can figure out where Tunisia is. But she she's like, that's a former USSR republic, but she went to the little girl's old school, those blue globes, you spin it, and she had to look it up on the map. She goes, "Okay, there's Ukraine." Well, interestingly enough, she didn't tell me about this. She treasured it in her heart for about 6 months, told some of her friends who were real prayer warriors to just be praying for her. And then she pops this on me on our anniversary. And we were out to eat because she's like, "Okay, we're in a public place and he's going to be in a good
Happy
mood."
anniversary.
Yeah. And she goes, "The Lord spoke to me recently and said we need to adopt a little boy from Ukraine." And I'm like, "No way. I have 3 girls." And then she said, "Not a baby." And I'm like, I didn't just fall at the turnip truck yesterday. I mean, you get
Mm.
into the issues of, kids who are, God bless them, but kids who are in orphanage in Eastern Europe, Central Europe. I mean, they're not coming from, usually healthy, functional family situations. And she said, "Well, that's what the Lord told me." And so anyway, fast forward, the Lord finally grabbed me by the scruff of my neck, and I wrestled with him. I did a little Jacob moment, and finally, I said, "Okay, Lord." I read the verse in James, "Take care of the widows and orphans," and we've all read that a ton of times. But suddenly,
Yeah.
it was a mandate, and I could either silently obey or disobey. And we all have those moments every day. I have those. We have them, and no one else will know. And I could have glossed it over with my Christianese. I've been in this subculture, a long time. The right words to say.
Absolutely.
So anyway, that was in '07. So we ended up flying to Ukraine, and that was about 2 years of prep, FBI background checks. I mean, it's it's like
Oh my word.
going through escrow on a home times 10. The paperwork, it's incredibly crazy. But we went and we met this little guy, and in Mariupol, we flew into Kyiv, beautiful city by the way, just gorgeous, and then we traveled down to Mariupol, which is like 400 or 500 miles, and beautiful city, port town, right near the Azov Sea, little part of the Black Sea area, and we ended up adopting this little guy, and his name was Zhenya, and so we thought, Americans can have a little tough time pronouncing that name, so we named him Corey after my great grandfather, and we kept Zhenya as his middle name, and he is now 22 years old. So that's a bit more than you guys probably needed, but it sets the stage for why I was in
I
a position,
appreciate it.
you know. And then in 14, of course, Russia annexed Crimea. There was the Maidan Revolution that we all were
Mm.
aware of happening in Kyiv. There was a fairly bloodless, I mean, it wasn't completely, but a fairly bloodless transition of power to more democratic regime And then the more hard right, more Soviet type, Yanukovych was ousted and had to go to Belarus. But anyway, so we've been really following closely what's happening over there, especially as Corey got older and he's like, "What's happening today, Dad, in the Civil War?" So, most Americans were aware there was something happening in the Donbass region, that southeastern part of Ukraine, but we were following it pretty closely. So, having a son from Ukraine, it just kind of instilled that perspective in us and especially myself, I have a journalism background, writing, editing, and I just kind of kept on top of things. So fast forward then again to February 24th of 2022. Despite claims, from the Kremlin that they were not going to invade Ukraine, they did. We kind of all knew that they would. I mean, you don't just position like 250,000 troops on your neighbor's border just
to do
because
it.
just to sing Kumbaya. So the invasion happened, and went to church that Sunday, Life Church here, and my pastor, Benji Hornig, he's like, "I'm shelving my sermon today, and we're going to just pray for Ukraine and pray for
Wow.
peace and pray for
Wow.
a limitation of violence there." And I went home that night, and I was just really, really, I had like an indignation, like just a rage, because we'd gotten to know people in Ukraine. I knew a lot of people within the evangelical movement there, which is pretty large. And we had, facilitators and people that we knew through the adoption agency that we kept in. I made an effort to keep in touch with. So it was very intense. And I'm on Telegram or WhatsApp, back and forth with friends in Kyiv. And they said, "It's really dire, Kyle. I mean, we're not going to be able to stop Russia. They're the number 2 military in the world. We don't know what's going to happen. We have to flee." And so that night, the Lord just dropped this. I was just praying. I'm like, "Lord, I feel so helpless. I know I can give and give money, and that as a side note, that's the most powerful thing we can do: give money to the organizations we trust that can help." But he dropped this idea. And as you mentioned, I work with Toby Mack on a couple books, and DC Talk and Michael Tate, great guys. And if you recall, they did the book Jesus Freaks, which is a story, it's a collection of the, martyrs. And then I did a book with them called Under God, which was more of sort of the faith foundation and looking at the roots of America. But it wasn't just a whitewash. I mean, we looked at the atrocities, the Native American situation, the African American situation, looking at Sojourner Truth, and just a lot of the gritty details, and I thought that's a great way to tell a story. And what the Lord did is dropped in my spirit, "I want you to write a book of stories, but I want you to get out of the way and don't just inject your opinions and everything. Just capture stories of Ukrainians on the ground." So that kind of kicked off a process with a colleague of mine named Esther Fedorkevich, and you could probably tell by her name, she's from that part of the world. And indeed, her roots in Ukraine go back on both sides, like 3 generations. So I talked to Esther, who's a prominent literary agent in our industry. And together we decided to do this. And within like 3 days, we had a book deal, which is unheard of. And within about 2 weeks, I was on a plane. And so in late March of 2022, on about the 1-month anniversary of the invasion, I was landing in Krakow, Poland, and I made some contacts, whatnot, with like Convoy of Hope and Samaritan's Purse and some other organizations on the ground there, relief and humanitarian organizations. And then God just opened these incredible doors for me, Will and Josh, that I couldn't have opened on my own. And within about a 3-week period, I interviewed soldiers, refugees, Polish aid workers at the border from Israel, Egypt. I mean, it was the Red Crescent, the Red Cross. I can't remember the name from Israel, but it was such an overwhelming, beautiful experience, which sounds weird because these refugees are in a horrific, hellish situation coming over the border, but the humanitarian side was completely undid me, because you had all the religions of the world there working together. And I was meeting vanfuls of people from Portugal that had driven 3 days, Germany, the UK, like through the channel and then cross Europe, and just wanting to do something. And at the time, the flow, as you guys will recall, the height of it, 14 million Ukrainians came across the border, which is like there's
Holy
only 45 million
smokes.
people in the country. So now, since then, about 10 million have gone back. There's about 3 or 4 million still remaining in Europe. But that's kind of the arc of how I ended up in Poland and how I ended up crossing into Western Ukraine and doing some interviews there as well. And kind of much to my wife's chagrin, but I explained there's no bombing going on where I'm going, and then I came back and I wrote the book in like 5 weeks, which was insane.
That's
But
crazy.
there you go, and it was overall just a life-changing experience.
I think that's so cool. And I love just hearing your heart and kind of like how God has sort of, used maybe first your wife and then by osmosis, use you both and then you. So I just think that's pretty phenomenal. And that's just kind of, that's what our God does,
Yeah,
and I think it's phenomenal. But you know, being that you have been to Ukraine, you've seen, the devastation, but you've also seen just the humanity of some folks. And this is going to be a little bit of a political question, but
it's
not
okay.
totally. Because that's sort of my shtick. Like I'm the political guy, right? And Josh is the
Yeah,
radical conservative. How much the U.S. should be involved with what's going on in Ukraine, and I'd love to just kind of get your thoughts about like what is the proper level of involvement for the
right.
United States government to be involved with Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so first of all, just to clarify, I am not a war journalist.
Mm.
I'm not a political reporter. I'm a dad. I am a writer, and I do have a journalism background, mostly in the Christian, in the faith-based space. But I will say that, so I'm coming at it, Will, from that position, with my experience in working with hundreds of authors, and so mostly from a spiritual perspective. So I would begin by saying my dad was a believer. I was fortunate to have a great role model in my father, and he always taught me to pray the news. And so what I try to do is pray all the news. Like I'm usually on YouTube for a lot of my news. From Al Jazeera to Fox to MSNBC to Reuters, BBC, New York Times. I try to read broadly, and sorry to plug another app. I use an app called Ground,
Mhm.
which kind of does an algorithm that tells
It's
you if
great.
stories are left, right,
Yeah, yeah.
center.
Yeah,
You
it's
guys are
great.
probably very familiar with it, I'm sure. Look who I'm talking to. Um, but none of us are unbiased in our opinions. No
Right.
journalist who you go on the best journal, whether you listen to NPR or Fox, no journalist is unbiased. They will say they are, but it's just not possible. So coming at it, a lot of disclaimers there. I would say that I'm going to answer your question, but I want to read a paragraph, if you don't mind, from the book. This is not shameless plugging, guys. It's because I feel like
Please do.
I had a sense we'd talk about this. And I met a gentleman, one of the most fascinating interviews I had there. He was a gentleman named Valentin Karenovich. He's probably in his mid to late 60s now. He's a pastor now in Kiev, and he's a professor at European Theological Seminary. You may notice the name of the town Irpin, where a lot of the atrocities took place at the beginning of the war. A lot of the Hague uh, war crimes have been logged and are being processed there by what happened there. Terrible murder of innocent people. Anyway, Colonel Krinovich, before he became a pastor, a Christian, was in the Red Army. So he was an officer. He was a colonel in the Soviet army. And when the wall fell, he's
Wow.
like to his wife, he's like, "What do you want to do now? Should we stay in the army?" I mean, he was a a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, atheist to the core, followed the party line. So he and his wife decided to go and kind of regroup and move back to Ukraine, where his parents lived. And he was there. He became a Christian there. And then he's like, he met some Americans and leaders in the church here and in chaplaincy programs. And one of them challenged him and said, you need to start a born again or an evangelical chaplaincy program in Ukraine. And he goes, I didn't think Christians were allowed in the military because that wasn't his experience, right? And he's a brand new believer, but he's brilliant, right? And so fast forward, that's what he ended up doing. Plus, he became a colonel in the Ukrainian army. So when I talk to Colonel Karinovich, I joke with him and I say, you were probably among a handful of born-again people in the world that served both as an officer in the Soviet Red Army up until '89 and in the
Yeah, I
Ukrainian
can't even.
army after the. It's pretty. He's just a purple cow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reading to you how he might answer your question partially, and then I'll answer the rest of it. He says toward the end of his chapter, I think God wants to achieve several goals through this war. The first is to motivate his people to pray and to prepare for the second coming of Christ. I get a little bit emotional when I read that. We live in a time when the Antichrist will come from one side, and God is preparing us for this. But from the other side, God prepares something opposite. God's other goal in this war is to destroy the Antichrist spirit in Moscow and even in Ukraine, where many people still have a Soviet world mentality. So at its crux, I would agree with Colonel Karinovich that on a spiritual level, and I'm not demonizing Russia. I know a lot of believers there. You guys probably do too. But there's an animating spirit, I think, that is in some, not all, the politicians there, that is just born out of a very atheistic, non-deistic, theistic approach to worldview and thought. And I think that's part of the reason that I think that had a lot to do with the illegal invasion. I do call it blatantly an illegal invasion into a peaceful neighboring country. How much we should be giving, I think it's better to send a very minute portion of our overall military budget than it is to put soldiers on the ground. And I think it's that serious. I think that Putin, if left to his devices, would not stop in Ukraine. I believe it would spill into Moldova. You've seen lately what the Hungarian Orban and the Slovakian Prime Minister Fico, who was just elected on October 4th, have said. They're kind of aligning with President Putin. And so I try to pray the news every morning. But I'm cognizant of the fact that, like everybody, I can easily fall into binary fallacy, which says that, Russia's evil and we're, the great United States, and our soldiers have committed atrocities as well through the years. Unfortunately, there's bad apples in every military, but so hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
I think it's better to send as much material. I think we're not sending enough, frankly. I think this sort of trickle method is just is unfortunate, and that the longer range missiles in the F-16 should have been there a year ago. That's my personal opinion.
I agree.
Wow. Wow. Well, that's super cool to hear that, and to hear from someone who has a lot of you have skin in the game, right? Your son is from Ukraine, so I didn't even know Mariupol was a place until I saw that it was attacked, right? That it was a city. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Probably, I would assume I'm like a lot of Americans. I mean, I'm sure a bunch knew what that was, but probably my guess is many, many, many were like me, having no idea and not really thinking about Ukraine ever, until the Ukraine war started.
Yeah, I mean, why would you? It's like, the Civil War in Yemen. It's I try to follow it, but I don't have a lot of skin in that
Yeah,
game.
it's
So
like you're not emotionally compelled to follow it
right.
necessarily. But when you're going through these different narratives, what did you find out about the intersection of faith and the instinct to survive amidst the adversities of war? How did those two things
Right.
come together? This beauty of faith and then this raw, just instinct to survive, which means to kill and different like things like that, depending on the situation.
Right.
So how did you experience that? What do you have any insight on that?
Sure. Sure. And before I answer, I just want to agree with you on that. Josh, that I am emotional about it, and I'm not unbiased. I've been trying to I've for a while now there's my dog. Sorry, I gotta
No worries. We've
close
had
the
dogs
I that's
before.
my yeah, I'm sure you have. So he likes to chime in. So I have a son who's 22. He wants to go kick butt, and it's everything I can do to keep him from jumping on a plane,
Mm,
flying into Poland, taking the train to, Przemysl, which is the
yeah.
largest border crossing, and getting his tail over to Lviv and joining the International Legion. That's what he wants to do. He wants to go kick some butt.
Mm,
And he was in Young Marines here at Camp Pendleton and has, prayed and thought about Marine Corps. I would be very proud of him to do that. But
mm,
I just I'd rather he not go fight for the Legion. He's studying to be a welder. I said, let's wait till the war's over and I will go with you. And if you want to live there, because he's learning the language, and you want to weld and help rebuild, that's my deal with you. So so
mm.
I kind of bribed him with that. But anyway, when I
It makes
saw there
sense.
when I was there, right, which was right at the beginning, interviewing a lot of people on the front line, and the specter of death was something I'd never seen. I didn't serve in the military. I'm not a frontline servant in fire or police or in the medical field. I haven't been exposed to that. And to talk and look someone in the eye whose husband was killed, in Kharkiv, and then to talk to the wife and the two little girls at the border. They've just spent 30 months, underground, living off of pond water that's boiled, living off of beans, looking like, super thin and just hollowed out. And sitting there at the border and waiting in line with them to cross back over, which is what I did. I walked over and then I wanted to walk back, and it was like a 9 to 10 hour experience that changed my life. But and one stark kind of word picture about that intersection, actually, two people personify um, what you're asking me. One was a gentleman, when I was standing in line. So everyone I was standing in line with had just come off a bus at the border from Kharkiv. And at the time, Kharkiv was still in Russian hands. It's since been liberated by the Ukrainians about a year ago. Ukraine took Kharkiv back. It's right on the border, and it's just been pummeled. But so here I am in line. I'm standing in line, right? And with all these people from Kharkiv, and some of the younger people are speaking English, and they're just telling me stories that I'm just like, I don't know whether to cry for joy that they made it out, or laugh or cry or whatever. But so I'm there, and I meet this man in front of me who he's with his family, and I said, "What are your plans when you get to Poland?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to get my family back set up, and I'm going back in." And I said, "But he aren't you over fighting age? Over 60, the men don't have to stay; they can leave." And he goes, "Yeah, but I have to go back. It's my home." He said, "They can destroy every house there, but it is my home, and we will fight for it. God willing, we'll be able to save it." And then another story, and I spoke to a couple other people there who were believers, um, and probably Ukrainian Orthodox, but we were talking about Jesus, and they said that they'd seen evil that they couldn't have imagined, but they believed that that they would emerge, and that that God had not abandoned them, which is pretty incredible, because that had been tested to the they had gone through things worse than Job, and but the other part of this that I think answers your question is, once you cross over from through the Ukrainian customs, there's a gray zone of about a quarter mile that you walk through. It's really surreal. And then you get to the Polish border crossing. Well, at the Ukrainian one, there was no metal detector, but to get into Poland, there is. So a lot of people will dump whatever, metal stuff they have that they can't take over. And I met an aid worker there as I was standing in line to get through the Polish customs, and it was kind of outside. It was dark. It was 11 p.m. at night, and he said, "Do you see that? Do you see that pile that knife over there?" And I looked over. There was a steak knife that that somebody had obviously like poked through the fence, like the fencing, and it was just laying on the ground. He said, "Every week we have to go over and clean up huge piles of knives there." I said, "What? Why?" He said, "The Ukrainian women, when they flee their homes, they've heard the stories of the Russian soldiers stopping the trains and raping the women, and it's the only protection they have. And once they reach the border crossing, they realize they're going to be safe, and so they can ditch their knives."
Wow.
And he said, every week we have to clean up hundreds of knives from Ukrainian women trying to protect themselves. And then once you got to the other side, the following day, I went and I was interviewing some folks from Israel, from one of their prominent aid organizations, and I said, "What do you need the most?" And they said, "Rape kits." He said, "We've run out of rape kits." And he said, most of a lot of the Ukrainian women want them for their children. So that's something obviously that embeds in you, that haunts me. And again, I'm not trying to demonize all Russian soldiers, but there's been enough of that. It's evil. It's reprehensible.
Yeah.
And but that hopefully answers your question about that intersection. I saw the extremes of both.
Yes. The beauty of faith,
which
the horror of survival, fighting for survival,
right.
having to fight.
Yeah.
And then these gritty stories that you're obviously trying to make sure people understand the reality, right? We just had a podcast with Dr. Stephen Hassan, and he said he's an expert on cults, and he's an expert on how people get someone like to believe misinformation.
Right.
Oh, go ahead. What were you saying? Oh, sorry.
No.
Okay. So anyway, we just had this interview with him, and he talks about how important it is that we're actually trying to see reality for what it is. He calls it a reality check. That like cult leaders, right, or people in cults, he walks them through if they're trying to, deprogram and reprogram. He has to walk them through. Okay, how do we do a reality check? And I think that this book can be a reality check for a lot of Christians as to see, hey, here's what's really happening. Here's what's going on in all of this. And in that grittiness, how do you think your experience has either challenged or reinforced your understanding of the human cost of war?
Right. It was humbling to be able to. I wasn't on the front line, obviously, but I was talking to people who had been or who were like Colonel Karenovich. So he now heads up the largest chaplaincy program in Ukraine. So they're called war chaplains. And he says, I am in touch with hundreds of chaplains across the whole 1,000 mile or 1,000 kilometer front line. It's beyond the pale. I mean, anybody who's been in trench warfare, I just rewatched Gettysburg the other night, the movie, and I'm looking at these guys 170 years ago fighting in trenches. And then you go watch the video clips of the war in Ukraine, and it ain't much different. Obviously, the weaponry is very advanced, but these guys are like firing at each other from like 30 feet away, or it's like Saving Private Ryan. But it's not a movie, you know? And the reality is, it's beyond what I can understand, you know? But I feel like God was able to open a window for me to at least capture, you know, a little capsule of stories, right? That were captured from a very, you know, limited number of people. There's like 25 stories in a limited amount of time, in a limited specific period in history. But for me, it did reinforce how deplorable war is, which sounds almost cliche and hollow. But just watching, you know, obviously we all watched what happened originally, you know, and the Hamas came over at the festival, and then through the kibbutzes and in the area right on the bordering Gaza Strip, and then we've seen little children in Palestinian in the hospitals in Gaza, and it rips you apart. And that's with our biblical picture of, you know, the Jews as God's chosen people, and it's like, man, what? It's the old, and I don't mean to delve into that, but I'm saying it's a conundrum of the human spirit. And I would be lying to you if I told you I could wrap my arms all the way around it. I'm just trying to, I'm just wake up today and like, Lord, you know, like Charles Colson used to say, how now shall I live today? How do you want me to pray? What can I do from my little corner of the earth here in San Diego, you know, for the people you've placed in my life? But I don't presume to have the answers to, you know, to everything. I will say one other thing. I do have a lot of friends who are, I call myself a pretty moderate um, evangelical in terms of, you know, I do believe in climate change and things. Some of your listeners are going to throw
It's all
tomatoes at
right.
me,
They've already thrown them at
but
me.
I'm also I'm very pro-life. You know, I'm a staunch pro-life guy. But here's the thing. I have been kind of just gobsmacked by the what I see as fake news about how horrific the Ukrainian government is, and that Putin is he really such a bad guy? There's almost this sort of quiet winking and nodding of acceptance in a way of well, you know, Ukraine is in bed with the Bidens, and there's a bunch of secret biolabs over there, and I'm like, you know, guys, all I have is my experience, and I have a lot of God-loving, Jesus-loving people there on the ground. When I share that with them, they go, that is the most ridiculous. Have them come and see what they've done to our wives and our children, and indiscriminately bombing cities just to take out the power grid so that there's no heat in the winter. Mark my words, in the next couple of months, it starts getting colder. Russians will start hitting the power grids again. That's not a military action. That's to terrorize the civilians. So obviously, I'm tipping my hand a bit here as to my proclivities and where I stand. But
It's fine. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Like I hear all the same comments about Ukraine, and even about, you know, what's happening with Israel and Palestine. And then, you know, a lot of my own, I don't know, exercises or things that I have to try to keep myself from doing is just try not to look at it as so black and white. Because, you know, let's say, you know, everything that they're saying about Biden and Ukraine is true. Well, that doesn't negate the suffering that
exactly.
happened. like people are still, you
They're
know,
suffering.
getting
They're
raped
getting
and tortured
shot.
and killed,
It's like,
Right.
and it's like that's important too, you know, like maybe more so than what Hunter Biden's up to in
Right.
Ukraine. So
Yeah.
but you know, I want to ask you though um about like miraculous or even like
Sure.
divine interventions that you may have seen, or maybe can't be explained by, you know, anything else than like God
Yeah.
was in this. And you know, I know that we've got listeners, watchers of the show that come from all different faith
Sure.
backgrounds or no faith. And, and I say often on the show, like I didn't grow up Christian. Like I came to faith in 2008 when I married my wife, who was a PK. And another way to look at this is she recruited me into the cult of one. And
She
I
definitely has
haven't
undue
left.
influence on you. Will.
She had
Yeah.
undue influence on me, but
Yeah.
like,
That sounds awesome though. She
you know,
sounds
like
like a dynamo.
yeah. I don't think her father listens to this podcast, but let's just say that I might have overemphasized how Christian I was when I wasn't at the time that I was courting her. So Larry, if you're watching this, I'm
I
sorry.
love it.
but like,
Yeah.
but like, I do believe in miracles.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a believer, and
Right.
I've mentioned before that, like, so I was in the service. I was injured. My left knee was like, I don't know, twisted, all kinds. It was messed
Mm.
up, and I used to wear a knee brace on it. And I was on this mission trip where this pastor had asked if he could pray for it. And I'm just like, whatever, dude. Yeah, sure. Like, and he prayed for it. And like, I didn't have to wear the knee brace anymore. Like it was immediate. And
I
I'm
love
just
it.
like, I was like, I don't know how that works.
He wrecked your theology. It's
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah.
I love to hear stories
Yeah.
of stuff maybe you've seen or experienced when you're over
Yeah.
there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, because a lot of what I've been talking about is pretty gloomy and dark, but I do have some pretty incredible stories. And one of my favorites was my church here. We have a sister organization in Kyiv, an orphanage there that we support. We've been doing it for years. And so when the war broke out, and even that night I mentioned where my pastor shelved his sermon and we just prayed. It was like on the 26th or 7th, like the war broke out, I think, on a Tuesday, and it was that following Sunday. And my pastor Benji was immediately in touch with the orphanage, one of the bigger ones, like 200 kids, right? And he's like, "What do we do?" And at that time, remember, guys, we all thought Russia was just gonna roll into Kyiv, like the SS did into
And the
Poland. We thought it
Taliban
was
did
just
into
going to be over.
Afghanistan. Like not that far
Exactly
before.
right. Right. I mean, who thought that the Ukrainians were going to put up resistance enough to save their capital? I mean, in Vegas, the odds would have been like 1,000 to 1. But anyway, they did. And but at the time, people were terrified. And can you imagine you're running an orphanage, it's, all run by Christians, and they're like, we got to get these kids the hell out of here. So they try to find buses. Well, as you can imagine, everybody and their mom is trying to get a
Yes.
bus, right? Or they finally find 2 buses to get the kids out, maybe 3, I can't remember. It was like buses and then little, minivans. So they're hightailing it. Like by the 25th, the night of the 25th, within 24 hours, they're out of there. And so they leave, and they are literally going down the southern route out of Kyiv because the Russians are coming in from the north, right? And out of Belarus. And they know, okay, we got to kind of skirt around here, but they can see the glow of artillery fire. They can hear it, and they're telling the kids it's fireworks. And but the war is this close, and so they got this precious cargo, right? And so the first thing that happens, they're in the middle of nowhere, and Ukraine, it's a gorgeous country. I mean, most of it's just like sunflowers in the summertime and just a lot of agriculture, and the soil's super rich. And they're suddenly, but this is of course March, so it's just it's like Minnesota or whatever. And one of the buses breaks down, and they can hear this artillery getting closer and closer. Suddenly, literally out of nowhere, a bus coming in the opposite direction, in other words, coming from the Polish border or coming from east toward the west, excuse me, other way around, from the west toward the east, pulls up, and the guy opens the door and he goes, "What's going on?" He goes, "We broke down. We don't know what to do." And he goes, "Oh, well, I just dropped off a bunch of refugees at the border. I'll take you." So they're like, "Oh my gosh, thank you, Lord, thank you."
It's
So they all
amazing.
pile on this bus. Off they go again. So about an hour later, they're like, okay, the kids need, they need a rest stop. They need to get something to drink, go to the bathroom. So they stop at this gas station kind of place. all the kids pile out. I mean, imagine that's like herding kittens, right? 200 orphans, middle of the night, trying to get them in to get some water and a snack. And so suddenly these two Ukrainian police cars pull up, like literally screeching into the parking lot. So the Russian army is a mile out of town. You have to hightail it. It's dangerous. We will show you how to get out of here. So now they got to get all the kids back on the bus. Just to put yourself
I
in.
can't. I
It's
can't.
like, do
I
we have a
can't.
head? How do you do a head count? Where's little Nikolai? He's like 3, or whatever. So they think they have everybody, but it's taking an excruciating amount of time. Suddenly they hear something. They can hear ping ping against the back of the last bus. It's small arms fire. So the cops are like, we gotta go. So they're following the cops around these roads. They're seeing burned out cars. They're trying to make the kids not look outside, to avoid seeing dead bodies. And miraculously, they get out of there and they reach the border. And not only that, but the cop cars escort them. If you recall, there was like 30-hour lines. And I talked to people who had to go through this 30-hour lines at the border to get across of cars. There were so many people trying to get out. And the same if you're on foot. Like I said, it took me 9 hours to cross back from Ukraine to Poland. It took me 20 minutes to cross in and then 9 hours to get out. But they got a personal escort in the opposite side of the highway by these police cars to get these kids, these orphans, safely into Poland. When they got there, they're profusely thanking this bus driver, this mystery man who shows up out of nowhere, right? And they're like, "We need your name." They're trying to give him cash. He's like, "No, I don't take any money for that. I'm not taking any money, And so they get his name and his contact, and they take a photo of the name of the bus company because they want to follow up. So they get these kids to Germany, and the leaders then are like, okay, now we can take a deep breath, and we got to thank this bus company, and they try looking for it. They try the numbers of the man, disconnected. There's no social media, nothing online about this bus company. My pastor said, look, people get cynical about what they call a miracle. He goes, I call that a supernatural experience, And so that's a
That's
really cool
wild.
story. And it shows you that God was, and there are several like that I heard. I mean, I wasn't looking for those stories. It's like you weren't looking. By the way, Will, I had a similar experience. I had asthma most of my life, and I was 42, and I was in Argentina on a prayer, and somebody prayed for my asthma, and I haven't used an inhaler
That's
since,
amazing.
Wow. It's
and it
so
was pretty
awesome.
bad before that. So, but yeah, man, God is he's a
Yeah.
supernatural God. We can call it whatever we want, but
Sure. Yeah.
he loves to do that kind of stuff,
There's a tension that comes up in that, right? Because, and
Yeah,
we all know the tension, right? There are certain people that weren't there, the mysterious angel bus, who knows, man, maybe it was an angel.
yeah,
I mean, I'm like, that's unbelievable. But
it is.
and I don't have an answer to this, and I'm not expecting an answer, like, you know what I mean? But just to wrestle with it a little
Sure.
bit with us and with me and Will and our audience, how is it, like, what do you make of the fact that you have this amazing story of clearly these coincidences and all these things lining up perfectly to get these kids out in the nick of time?
Right.
How do you line that up and wrestle with that, with all the stories of atrocity that you heard?
Yeah. War is obviously a terrible thing. I don't think God invites or wants war anywhere. Of course, we all have free will. I mean, we know that story, and that's the way we're raised. Why do good things happen to bad things happen to good people? Rabbi Kirshner's incredible, classic book. And all I can say is that I think in any times of evil, there's always a remnant. And I would say to your audience particularly, don't forget about the just the normal people who are suffering. and we all have our filter of our Bible, and I have my views about Israel and the Jews being God's chosen people, but that does not mean that I want Palestinian kids to die, you know? And those two things are not mutually exclusive. And unfortunately, like you said earlier, Will, a lot of public discourse now is just black and white all the way up to Capitol Hill. And it's either, it's all evil or it's all good. And obviously there's complexities to it. Ukraine, obviously there's corruption in every government. Every government has corruption. Okay. So back to the Hunter Biden thing, even if it's all true, maybe there are secret biolabs. Does that still justify literally tens of thousands of innocent civilians dying to date, with more to come, unfortunately? So yeah, but I think that what it says to me is that amidst things that God isn't rejoicing over at all, he's weeping over them, and Jesus would be weeping too. There's a remnant, and I think intercessory prayer is incredibly effective, and I would just encourage us all not to forget the Ukrainian people and to keep praying, and the Russian people, and for justice and righteousness to prevail somehow amidst this bloody mess.
Yeah. When was the last time you were there?
So originally in '07, I was there for over a month to adopt, and then I was there. I went into Western Ukraine just for a day a year ago.
Okay, got it.
Yeah,
Because I'm curious, like, I mean, kind of to your point earlier about, watching Gettysburg and thinking like Saving Private Ryan. I'd love to kind of get your feel based on your interactions with people of
yeah,
like talk about the resolve of the citizens there. Because I mean, really, it is like, I mean, it's about as David and Goliath as you could possibly think.
right,
You got, and
right,
you really have to look at a map to appreciate like the scale, scope, and
yeah,
size of who they're fighting.
right,
And say what you will about President Zelensky. I mean, but he
right,
seems to be doing all the right things, at least publicly, to keep his people safe, and
right,
doesn't necessarily seem to be letting it go to his head again, like publicly. I mean, who knows what's
right.
happening behind closed doors, but
Absolutely.
so I'd love for you just to kind of give our audience a feel for you Ukrainians as a people, and
Yeah,
maybe a chance just for you to kind of gloat a little bit as a dad of a Ukrainian,
yeah,
like, do you see some of those same characteristics in your son?
yeah. I mean, we all saw it right at the beginning when when that Russian warship sailed to Snake Island, which is this tiny little rock, and they were, there's like 20 Ukrainian soldiers there. They're probably mostly techs. They probably weren't even,
Yeah.
I don't even know if they were armed, and they said, you need to surrender from they were whatever, ship to shore radio, and they said, Russia, go F
That's so
yourselves.
crazy.
that kind of personifies the Russian mentality. It's kind of like, what people don't understand too is that they've been a war hardened people for a decade now, because the Donbass war started in 14, and they've been fighting for 10 years against Russia, and then against separatist pro-Russian forces in Luhansk and Donetsk down in there in the Donbass region. And what a lot of people don't realize too is that it was either 1 or 2 year service. So there are actually like 3 million people in Ukraine, adults that who have military experience. And I think we forget that. I think if there had been no ironically, if there had been no civil war, Russia probably would have just marched on. They would have goose-stepped their way into the center of Maidan Plaza in Kyiv. But the fact that the Ukrainians, they MacGyver everything. I mean, they've obviously revolutionized the use of the $100 drone. I mean, it will. I'm sure war colleges, war colleges.
Yeah.
My uncle, who's a PhD in Central Asian politics, he taught at the War College in Rhode Island. But I'm sure they're going to be teaching these tactics, you know, and so I think a lot of the whole David, the aspect of how was he able to take that one rock and hit Goliath right in the center of the forehead? Because I actually think this, despite the rhetoric out of the Kremlin, that you know, their prerogative was obviously to take Kyiv and to effect regime change, and they failed on both levels. And then miraculously, the Russians have lost over 50% of the territory they held
Wow.
3 weeks into the war. Like right away, they took a ton of territory. Right, they've lost. They're on their back feet even now. You know, I mean, they have a couple places they're trying to advance, but the front line is pretty much a stalemate. And I think, frankly, it's going to remain that until hopefully either Ukraine breaks through in the south or some sort of peace can prevail. You know, but they are incredibly tough people, and the mentality is every man, woman, and child. Like, we will not ever surrender. And so that's why Zelensky comes with this rhetoric of, we're not going to go to the peace table until, you know, they leave Crimea. And us in the West, we're like, well, you got to be reasonable. I mean, you got to compromise. They don't see it that way. They don't. They do not see it like that at all, which is admirable, but it's also troubling. And I'm not judging them. It's their own country's decision. But sitting here safely in San Diego, I'm like, geez, how many generations of your young men do you have to send to the front lines?
Yeah.
You know, and it's I don't know. Thankfully, you know, Jesus has the wheel.
No
but
easy answers.
It's pretty grim
No
right
easy
now.
answers.
No.
You know, there's a funny
there's not.
meme, just to inject a little humor, that when it says I'm
Yeah.
sure you've seen
Always
it,
good.
where someone's driving and they look over and they see one of the wheels on their car flying away, and they say, "Not that wheel, Jesus! Not that wheel!" That's a great one, dude. Because here's the thing, dude. You do need to be specific as to which wheel you're asking Jesus to take.
That's true.
Wheel can mean different things,
yeah,
can it not?
And that one is like, and who was that? Wasn't that like Carrie Underwood?
Probably. Who knows? But
right after she won American Idol, I think. But yeah, that one's kind of cliche. Well, the other bumper sticker I love is the one I saw driving to Utah on Highway 15, like through Vegas somewhere. It said, "Jesus loves you, but everybody else thinks you're a." It wasn't the word jackass, but it was similar to that.
That's a good
I love
one.
that one. And yeah,
you know,
but
one of the questions, and this is kind of the last big question, and then I don't know, last big one, but it'll probably be the one that the next one won't take as much time. But what has this war taught you in your experience in writing this book? How has it taught you about the human spirit's ability to do two things? One, to be altruistic and to care for their fellow man around them, their countrymen. And then two, the ability to keep going, the grit, the perseverance. What has this war taught you about the resilience, essentially, of the human spirit?
Yeah. There's a gentleman on Facebook that I'm friends with. I've never actually met him, but he's a pastor here and minister in San Diego. His name's Shannon Cap. And he has an organization that just started grassroots out of just his years of relationships over in Ukraine. And the name of the organization is "If You Don't Quit, You Win." And I love that. It's very simple, but that's kind of the idea here is, and Ukrainians have suffered, there's suffering's going on all over the world, obviously, places like Yemen and Sudan and South Sudan and Mali. And so, but this war, it is the largest war in Europe since World War II. And it's not just a regional conflict, it's affecting a lot of nations, a lot of different areas of the world. And altruism, I mean, we have to hold on to it, it separates us from the worst. I think the human animal, la bête humaine, as can't remember the author. You guys probably remember a French author around the turn of the 20th century. The human animal is the worst animal on the planet, right? I mean, we can do great evil, and that altruism is we desperately need it. I think we need it in our country right now. We're in a really intense, terrifying time, in my opinion. With division. And an inability seemingly to just cross the aisle. And I know that's what you guys are about. It's not left or right, it's looking up. And so you guys sum it up in your whole vision and mission for why you do what you do, which I totally commend. Is you have to grab a hold of altruism, and without I think without a realization of the fact that we have very little control. I think control is an illusion, and the deeper we go into the surrender is an enemy of the spirit. So do what we can do and not shrug and give
I
up.
love that. Control is an enemy of the spirit. And I totally agree with you. Our need to control leads us down to all sorts of weird and really, frankly, unhealthy and evil at times roads. This need for power. I mean, what is Putin doing at his core except for pursuing a need to control and have power over other people? I mean, you can have all sorts of different reasons and contextualize the reasons, and that's all well and good, but it's about power, and it always has been about power, right? So it's really compelling to hear your stories, Kyle, and the way that and I just want to thank you for going and bringing stories that Americans normally don't read, right? And an inside look into something where we have a lot of different opinions on it. It's easy for me to hear one of my friends or a colleague or something talk about their opinion that America shouldn't be in Ukraine or whatever. And that's fine. You can argue that. National policy, cool. But the reality is, dude, what's happening over there is a humanitarian crisis. What's going on in Gaza is going to create and has created an enormous humanitarian crisis, regardless and independent of the desires of Hamas and Israel. So what am I saying? I'm saying that I really I get grieved when I see the way in which some Christians talk about these issues as almost as if they're not nuanced, they're flippant about it, or even worse, that they would feel like God was okay with all this killing, and because they're not Christians or they're against, whatever. So the last question I have, and this is kind of just for,
it's like the Crusades, right?
Absolutely.
How do we justify?
We can't. Well, we can't. I mean, we can't do it like legitimately from the Bible as New Testament believers, I don't think, but apparently they did, and they found a way to do it, right? They found a way to convince a lot of people that it was true.
Yeah.
So, this last one though is really just your chance to say, what do you want our audience, and just to give you some context, our audience, it isn't a Christian podcast. Although we're both Christians, right? And we both, but we're trying, we've had many people of different views, many non-Christians on the show. People that, no one that I would say was like overtly hostile, but certainly not like people that we've had people that, would disagree very deeply with us. So
I get it.
To this audience, what do you want them to hear from you, your heart? And we've asked, they've heard it throughout these last hour and 4 minutes. They've heard it. They've experienced that, but this isn't a response to a specific question. This is, what do you want them to hear from you about this? What do you think is the most important thing you want them to take away from today?
We're all world citizens, even if we don't see ourselves that way. The planet's not that big. And I would encourage everyone to really pray the news. And I would also encourage people to do the best they can to get their news from a lot of different sources. And whether it's left, right, center, I don't care, but just a lot of different sources. But primarily, and thank you for that question. I'm humbled to be even sitting here with you guys and be able to answer it, is that I think that ultimately, as a Christian, I believe, these battles are terrible and what's happening in our world is awful, but we know how the war ends, so to speak. God does have a wonderful plan for all of us. In the meantime, no matter what your walk of faith is, the bottom line is 92% of Americans believe in a God, a higher power. So wherever you are as an audience member sitting in that, just remember that evil does not have to win, and it doesn't win. And so on a broader scale, I believe though that there is a battle. There is a battle in the heavenly realm between dark and light, and that supersedes human beings. It's beyond human. I think the devil will animate and use certain people, but this isn't about Russia being the bad guy and Ukraine being the good guy. It's more about, as you pray, what is the Holy Spirit leading you to pray for in that situation? Because the alignment we see today with a lot of kind of what I would call an anti-God spirit. It's easy to pick on the word Soviet, but I think that kind of personifies it. It's just a perspective that does not value life as much, I believe, as the Judeo-Christian mindset worldview would have us to. And so I would just encourage your listeners to thoughtfully try to listen to both sides. And if you're a praying person, pray for peace. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, quote unquote, in that part of the world, and also in other parts of the world. And that's all we can do. It sounds kind of kumbaya, but it ultimately that's all we have. Otherwise, we get swept away in the sea of cynicism, which is pretty easy to do, and we have to fight for that altruistic, outcropping that we can hang on to.
I read a book called A Praying Life. I definitely recommend it. But he talked about cynicism in that and the pride at the core of cynicism, that you can pronounce judgment on all these different things because you alone have the objective view to be able to be cynical, right? To be able to pronounce a judgment on it. So that's really good. So Kyle, how can they keep up with your work? Where can they get the book, Hope for Ukraine? How can they keep up with your work moving forward?
Sure. So the book's on Amazon, and pretty much I'm a man of a certain age, so I'm pretty much on Facebook. My daughters make fun of me that I'm not. I get a lot of TikTok videos from them. They're all in their 20s, so I do keep up on what's funny on TikTok, but I'm not on IG. So mostly Facebook or through my publisher, Baker Publishing Group, and you can leave a message for me through there. But yeah, man, I have a lot of friends on Facebook, and that's probably the easiest way personally to get in touch with me. Just drop me a DM or whatever. And but thank you both, Will and Josh. And again, you guys are a rare air, and I thank you for what you do. I'm really glad that you do it. I'm sure it's hard sometimes, like any job, but it's not even your core jobs, is it? I mean,
it costs
it's a side gig for you guys.
But
so
we do it willingly and thankfully.
Guys, so audience members, support Faithful Politics.
Shameless
this is
plug.
A light in the darkness.
Absolutely.
Exactly. I can do it.
Kyle, thank you so much for being on. And man, I got to
thank
tell you,
so
I was enraptured in some of those stories. And that one about the orphans, dude, that is a story for the ages, man. That's an amazing story.
It's
Yes.
cool, isn't it?
What?
I know.
No,
They're like, I'm not making
you
this stuff
can't
up,
make it up. No one would make
It's
that up. So
so 2 degrees of
exactly,
separation, let's say.
exactly,
Yeah, through my
exactly. Well,
pastor.
guys, thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining us and listening in. And this has been
Thank
Kyle
you.
Duncan. You can pick up his book, just like he said, at Amazon. It's Hope for Ukraine from Baker Publishing. Hope that you will pick up a copy and get inspired by the stories that are in there. And until we see you again, it's not left, it's not right. Keep your conversations up. Thanks, guys. God bless.
Amen.
um